this audience here in person, and of course those who are following us online. So today what I thought I would briefly talk about is the UK digital strategy and where it fits in what's happening now, with what's happening now, which is in one way or another more regulation and more rules around the world in the digital economy and applying to big tech. I mean, this is, I think, I should come clear immediately. I have always doubted whether there was such an compelling need or clear evidence that a new approach or new rules were required, but I think that battle, we can continue that intellectually and at universities, but it seems to me that practically and politically has been lost. And so the question is now, of course, what is the best way of introducing new rules, competition rules, or regulation that is not competition, which is the least damaging to what Hayek called in the lecture that we are celebrating and remembering today, the solution of the economic problem of society, which is a voyage of exploration into the unknown, to resolve new problems that are unexpected. And excessively strict regulation, I'm not saying anything new, may constrain unduly precisely that imagination, that ingenuity, that experimentation that takes us on this voyage into the unknown and allows us to solve new problems that are unexpected. There are new proposals and new bills and draft bills, as they are called somewhere, a little bit everywhere in the world. I looked very closely recently at Japan, for example, at South Korea, but for today's purposes we'll look at the three systems that I certainly know better than any other: the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom. I'll start with the United States because that's an extremely interesting time in the history of US antitrust. Now, it is about 25 years that I am in this country, and for about 9 years I have been at the UK Competition Authority, at the time called Office of Fair Trading. I have worked also very much, not exclusively, but a lot, on international affairs. And I do remember the times where the United States federal agencies and scholars and mainstream opinion was very much in favor of innovation and looking carefully at regulatory initiatives so that they would not stifle the voyage into the unknown. I do remember the criticism, sometimes harsh, of an European system that seemed, at least to our colleagues in the United States, to be premised on the idea that big is bad, and we should protect smaller companies and weaker competitors, and it's all about fairness, and it's not very much about economic effects, efficiencies, and impact of commercial conduct on consumers and on the long term of the economy. Now, there are now any number of bills in the Senate and in Congress, but you just pick three of them. We don't know whether they will become law or not. I guess if they do, the European Union will get a competitive advantage finally over the United States. But so if you look at this American Innovation in Choice Online Act introduced in the Senate, as the European proposals, they will pick out certain platforms. They call them not gatekeepers, but covered platforms. They will be designated exclusively based on quantitative criteria and whether or not they are a critical trading partner. I'm very pleased, of course, that the language used by the European Court of Justice since the 60s finally has found its way into a US federal bill. no analysis of market power, no analysis of anti-competitive effects, blanket prohibition of any number of types of conduct, such as tying, without looking at efficiencies, without looking at effects, self-preferencing, discrimination, and so on, and no efficiency defense. So no scope in the bill to look at efficiencies at all. You look at the Platform Competition and Opportunity Act. I mean, the titles are good. That's, I have to concede that. Now, again, designated platforms will be prohibited from carrying out any acquisition except if they prove, and the burden of proof is on them, that the acquisition falls under certain predetermined exclusions. For example, the target is not a competitor, the target is not a nascent or potential competitor, and so on. So this is clearly the reversal of the burden of proof, and quite a harsh and extreme one, I think. And last but not least, the Ending Platform Monopolies Act. An important word here is ending, of course. Quite what will end, it's quite a different matter. But this act, again, will designate a number of, any number of platforms, 6+, perhaps, we don't know. But it's probably the most draconian measure here, because it prohibits integration, vertical or horizontal integration, of any platform with any service that in any is linked or used by the platform itself, and in relation to what in Europe we may call core platform services, in a number of circumstances, and finally, if that gives rise to a conflict of interest. So clearly, Amazon would have to divest any merchant services that they have. There is a conflict of interest with Amazon Marketplace. But think about Google, for example. I mean, since pretty much everything that we do today and every service relies in one way or another on general search, a platform like Google may have to divest everything other than general search itself. So that's potentially, I mean, if this ever becomes law, the most significant of these bills. Now, moving now across the Atlantic to the European Union, at least for the purists, there is one piece of good news, that the Digital Markets Act is on its face declared not to be competition law. Now, you, of course, read the prohibition on self-preferencing, which is Google Shopping, Article 102 case. You read the prohibition of using data to compete unfairly with companies using the marketplace. You think about the ongoing Amazon case, etc. But when these things are transposed into the DMA, they are subject to a metamorphosis, and they are no longer competition law. They are regulation, but regulation that aims at keeping markets open, fair, and contestable, rather than aimed at preventing distortions of competition. So that's the main fundamental difference there. Interesting, but then looking at the substance of the proposed regulation, as we know, there is designation of gatekeepers. There is no analysis of market power as such, but there are quantitative criteria based on revenue, based on number of users, etc. They are rebuttable presumptions, but the history of rebuttable presumptions in EU competition law is that rebuttable presumptions are never rebutted. We will see, perhaps this is not competition law, so perhaps things will be different, work out to be different. And once the designation happens, then of course there are a number of prohibitions here as well. I won't go through the list of prohibitions, of course, but the important thing to bear in mind is no efficiency defense. just a defense of overriding reason public interest, so which is quite interesting, but no efficiency is taken into account, and remedies can include divestiture. So it would be less draconian than the US bill that I mentioned before, but still we can have divestiture remedies. Now, let's move, we moved across the Atlantic, let's move across the Channel to the United Kingdom. On this occasion, I should say, fortunately, no longer a member of the European Union, so DMA, whatever happens, will not apply over here. Many of us, many of you are already familiar with the UK digital strategy. It's been a few years in the making. A significant milestone, I think, was the Furman report. I think a very good report in many ways. Certainly compared to the at least to the published and public work that has been done in the European Union and for the European Commission, and a much more evidenced and evidence-based report that made a number of recommendations. Some of them were immediately discarded and rejected by the CMA itself, like particularly the one relating to the merger test, so changing the current test of probability of substantial lessening of competition to a balance of harms test. The greater the harm, the lower the standard of proof, and therefore the degree of likelihood of that harm. One of those tests that are clearly very intellectually sound but completely unworkable in practice. I mean, which competition authority has ever really quantified the harm from a merger precisely, and which judge or arbitrator or decision maker really believes that we can measure probability precisely, 62% or 47 or 75. But then the work was taken forward with the digital task force established by the CMA, and in the interest of time, let's fast forward to the UK government consultation paper that was published in July. I titled, I proposed as a title of this these brief observations, "The Third Way," because I do think that the UK is indeed showing the world a different way of dealing with the digital economy, not necessarily ideal, as I said at the beginning. We are still talking about pretty draconian in certain areas regulation, but as I will try to show in the next 15 minutes or so, 10-15 minutes or so, I think certainly a better approach, more rooted in competition principles than is the case in the United States or in the European Union. First of all, I think, general principles are what they are, very often remain ink on paper, but there are nevertheless some good principles that the government puts forward. Intervention has to be evidence-based and targeted, lean, agile. The CMA and the digital market units should be equipped to act swiftly. The system must be based on openness, transparency, and accountability, and must be coherent. I mean, so nobody can really disagree with all of that. Let me just now make some observations. We'll jump from one bit to the other of the consultation paper. Of course, you all have read that, and there is no point in me just describing it in any detail. But first of all, it is a consultation paper that, as I said, is in line with what we would call orthodox competition thinking and competition analysis. And I think actually the good thing, and something to be commended surely, is that the government has even reined back from some of the proposals of the CMA that went a little bit too far. So a few examples just to give you a flavor of that, and things that I think are good, a good step forward. The objective of the new regime, promoting competition for the interest of consumers. Of course, the CMA, in this new political environment in which we find ourselves, proposed to add citizens. What does that mean? All and nothing, but of course it could have been the back door through which all sorts of other policies and interests and ideas, I mean privacy is probably the least harmful one, could have been smuggled into what should be a competition analysis. And quite rightly the government said, well, no, it is promoting competition in the interest of consumers. So focus on competition and sound economics, and also the CMA had proposed to insert language around innovation. The government here says, well, innovation is a key element and probably the most important one of competition, so we don't need to spell that out explicitly. Here I would probably have favored including innovation explicitly, but what I like is the focus on competition law as we know it. There was the proposal to give the CMA the power, the CMA and the Digital Markets Unit, which will sit in the CMA, is already there, by the way, although not on a statutory footing, the power to engage with other policy issues, and from industrial policy to labor to privacy and so on, freedom of information and so on. But here the government proposals is that a kind of open-ended test is undesirable, but that perhaps when drafting legislation they will look at some specific and clearly defined powers. Now that is clearly better than an open-ended test. At least if we have a clearly defined power, we know what policy is being applied and whether it does or does not trump competition law. I would still favor other policies being pursued by other regulators or by the government itself, whose function is at the end of the day to pursue policy. Other good things are clearly the coordination with other regulators, which is already going on. Ofcom, the Information Commissioner Office, and the FCA. And I think another good thing is the idea that regulation is tailor-made. So these are not blanket prohibitions that will apply to all designated gatekeepers, like under the DMA, and similarly under the majority of the US proposals, I think. But there will be codes of conduct tailor-made to each individual designated platform. Now, and I think, solicitors are also regulated in this way, right, with principles, objectives, and then guidance by our regulators. So that's an approach which at least has the benefit of being able to be targeted at specific problems. So a marketplace and the search engine and a social network are different businesses, different business models, and there can be different business models across, between two or more social networks or different search engines and so on. So that is also a good thing in my view. And another good thing is when one looks at the criteria for designation. So the criteria for designations, and the main criterion is really substantial entrenched market power. So That's basically the dominance test, a clear competition test. And the government rejects the proposal by the Digital Markets Task Force to include in this test the impact on markets with broader social or cultural importance. So the government here really brings the focus back firmly on market power and competition policy. Now, in relation to the codes of conduct and the principles and objectives, I'll say very little. I mean, the principles are fair trading, open choices, trust and transparency. Nobody can argue with those too much. The point is will be to see how they will become operational, and that is really about the so-called objectives, and then there will be guidance by the CMA in relation to specific platforms. If one looks at the the objectives that operationalize the principles, these are really a typified competition infringement. So exploitation of customers or consumers, tying, preventing interoperability, etc. It is so it is still that form, or rather the rather strict regulation that was mentioned before, but if one looks at the fine print, it is slightly better, I think, and better thought through. Say, for example, I mean, we were talking about interoperability earlier on, and say if you take the proposal, these are still proposals on interoperability, which comes under open choices, take reasonable steps to support interoperability with third-party technology, where not doing so would have an adverse effect on consumers. So the steps are reasonable, and there is a lot to be read into a reasonable test, and of course there is the test, the second test, which is adverse effect on customers. So it's not just about interoperability to help competitors and perhaps less efficient competitors, but there is the cross-check of the adverse effect on customers, which I think is important, because in operationalizing competition policy, the consumer harm test, not necessarily the consumer harm objective. I mean, I don't want to open up now the debate about consumer welfare, etc., but the consumer harm test, so to look at whether something that harms competitors also harms customers, is actually very important in terms of filtering out behavior that may be in fact efficient and pro-competitive, and precisely because it is efficient and pro-competitive, marginalizes firms that are less efficient than the firm in question. So moving then quickly on the pro-competitive interventions, the remedies that can be imposed, I'll say just one thing, that again the test that has been put forward by the government is a test of adverse effect on competition, which we know already from the markets regime, so it's not a revolution in UK competition law. Again, the Digital Task Force at the CMA suggested adding consumers. That would have been a different test from the market investigation test, adverse effect on competition and consumers. And rightly here, I think the government rejects that and keeps to the adverse effect on competition, rightly noting that an adverse effect on consumers is captured by an adverse effect on competition. But the problem is, I agree with the government's proposal here, because the problem is adding consumers could have again opened the back door to all sorts of arguments that it's not just about competition but also about consumers, and with all the issues relating to privacy, diversity, and all the wealth of human requirements and aspirations that can be then that should not, I think, be taken into account in this particular analysis. Now, I made a similar point at a conference in Italy, and one of the following speakers said, "Oh, you know, this is like in the UK. We are different from the UK because we do consider privacy and culture and so on important values." Of course, we do. The question is whether in a competition test they should be taken into account or not. So I want to be absolutely clear on that. The question is whether a competition authority looking at competition issues in digital markets should really be taking into account all these different policies, or rather the focus should be on competition, leaving to others to deal with these, I would say, more important, probably, matters, more important than competition, but precisely because they are more important, culture and diversity and so on, they should be dealt with by people who know better than competition officials. Now, not all is good. Not all is good in UK consultation paper, and really I want to just pick out two things that I think are really ugly, and I think are really going to be problematic if implemented. So the first is the suggestion that in relation to whatever the digital market unit at the CMA will do, the standard of review by the Competition Appeal Tribunal, the first tier judicial authority tribunal that will review these decisions, should be judicial review and not on the merits review. Now, you will know that currently for competition infringements in relation to decisions as to whether the competition prohibitions have been infringed, which may result in fines, in remedies, behavioral or structural, the standard of review is instead a full merit appeal. Now, I worked for 9 years at the Office of Fair Trading at the UK Competition Authority. Of course, a student would like to have a more lenient teacher. You know, I was thinking now about my academic role, and you know, it's not surprising that regulators, not only in this country but everywhere, would like more lenient judicial review standards. It makes the work easier. However, is that right constitutionally, I think? That's the question, and my answer to that question is no. I mean, first of all, there is a point about coherence of the system. One of the principles, general principles that the consultation paper sets out at the very beginning is coherence. Then we should look at coherence with the competition regime as well. If a structural remedy following an infringement of the Chapter 2 prohibition, the abuse of dominance prohibition, is subject to on the merits review, why should a structural remedy for breach of these new proposed rules not be subject to the same standard of review? And a full merits appeal, of course, keeps authorities and public authorities, regulators on their toes. I think it's a very important, and it's one of the best features of the UK competition regime and should be retained. The second really very ugly proposal is in relation to mergers. So there is no proposal here for a kind of blanket reversal of the burden of proof in relation to mergers. There are proposals about mandatory filings or at least mandatory provision of information by designated platforms about acquisitions, and that's, I mean, it's clearly an increased regulatory burden, but since these acquisitions will be notified anyway somewhere else, probably it's not a huge problem. But what's a huge problem is the suggestion, the proposal that the standard of proof or the standard for prohibiting a merger should be reduced from the balance of probabilities to reasonable prospect. Reasonable prospect that the merger may substantially lessen competition. Now, reasonable prospect is language we are used to under the civil procedure rules, for example. So it is a legal test that is used elsewhere, but using it in relation to mergers where there is a prospective analysis to be carried out on change in markets that could actually allow the competition authority to block pretty much everything they want. In relation to mergers, of course, the standard of review is already judicial review, not full merits, which is acceptable. I think it's in line with our constitutional system because the prohibition, the merger review is more in the nature of an administrative function rather than fining and prohibiting and apportioning blame and imposing remedies. But this whittling down of the standard of proof is really problematic. So, well done for the UK government up to a point, I think. Let's hope for the best and prepare for the worst. Thank you.
I think we have time to squeeze in maybe one quick question, if anyone has a question for Renato. Okay, well, I'll ask a quick question. I'm also really worried about the point you made at the end there about the standard of review. Now, obviously, I think there were some consultation questions around that specific issue. What do you think the chances are that we might see the government take on board any consultation responses? I mean, I know I made the point in my response that an on the merits review should be available at more points of the new process. What do you think the chances are of that going in the right direction?
I think it's a reasonable chance because the professions and of course business will be very much in favor of a full merits appeal, and those who are not, certain parts of business and the profession, of course, and the competition authority itself. But I think there are the arguments about the coherence of the system. There is a human rights argument, if I may say so, in our Article 6. We obviously, the EU Charter doesn't apply to us anymore, but the European Convention on Human Rights does in Article 6. And certainly there are decisions involving fines and potentially break up as well. I mean, that's so I think it's a reasonable chance, reasonable prospect.
Okay, that's hopeful. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.